The other day, my younger brother Shade was telling me that he's spent most of his time reading manga lately. So I asked him, what manga do I need to read and talk about the most? And he said, well, you might as well just read Frieren. It's pretty much the best. Now, I think it's a little too early to call Frieren the best manga, but I think it could very well be in the running. I certainly think that it is the breakout hit of the 2020s so far. It might not be as popular as Jujutsu Kaisen yet, and maybe it never will be, but it is the critical darling. And this is one of those stories that it starts off as a pleasant surprise. It starts off feeling like, wow, this is better than the genre. This is better than what we usually get out of stories that have this kind of aesthetic, that are set in this type of setting, this sort of deliberately generic fantasy setting. Although, while it is deliberately generic, it eventually becomes fleshed out on a level that it really kind of started making me forget about a lot of the similar stuff. It's rare, very rare, that something comes out that's so good it kind of bleaches away all the bullshit. But Frieren for me makes up for having had to sit through so much garbage in the 2010s. I mean, this is the culmination of all the best efforts of what came out last decade. And in a way, it can only be so good because there wasn't really anything perfect in this genre. There was nothing this good. At least in my opinion, I can't think of anything that even comes close. And the stuff that this bears the most obvious resemblance to on the surface, I would say tonally the thing that's the most similar to me is that time I got reincarnated as a slime. Now, this isn't isekai. It just feels kind of like isekai because it has so many video game tropes that it uses in its world building, and it's so focused on like the rules and mechanics of how the world works. But honestly, I mean, it goes beyond most isekai in dealing with that stuff. It's just so much more thought out. It's so much more robust in unveiling its setting as it goes. And so much more of the detail is interesting. More importantly than anything else, uh, most of the time, this story is interesting. At its very worst, it's just kind of a fun time. Like it's not always trying to be profound or super amazing or blow your mind. Sometimes it's just trying to be a good time, but it always succeeds at that in a way that so many anime fail. And as it goes, I mean, when you're starting off, you're thinking, wow, this is refreshing for something in its genre, in its style. But eventually, it comes to be that this isn't, you're not really comparing this to other stuff in the genre. You're comparing this to the best manga. Like, what this is actually comparable to, and it's in the conversation with, is Hunter x Hunter or Full Metal Alchemist or Yu Yu Hakusho or like these big adventure serials that are critically beloved, that have these massive arcs, that have these big expanse. One Piece, it remains to be seen how long this manga will go, but so far it's 128 chapters and it doesn't feel like it's gotten very far into its story. It feels like there's a ton of space. So many seeds have been planted, so many unanswered questions, a lot of which probably we will never get answers to, but considering how many questions have gotten answered along the way, I do think the manga is probably going to just check every single box that it can over the course of a very long run. If this thing goes for 20 years, 30 years, however long it takes, uh, I think it will be in the conversation with Berserk, with, Vinland Saga, with all of these classic manga. And I don't know if it will be taken as seriously as some of those because it's not as dark or as like gritty and difficult as some of those stories that people really feel emotionally affected by. I would say I definitely have felt a lot of strong emotions reading Frieren, but nothing that pushes me into like that visceral reaction that you get reading Berserk. But at the same time, that's kind of a good thing. It makes it way easier to imagine rereading this story. I don't think it's less deep necessarily. I would say that Berserk deals with such interesting and specific themes. I mean, there's no reason to compare them, right? There's no reason to say one is better than the other. Just the fact that it's even in the same conversation of, what I would consider with JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, with like these manga that I don't think it deserves comparison to currently because it's only 128 chapters, but what we have gotten out of it lives up to the quality of what we get from those type of stories, and the only thing holding it back from being as good as them is that the length of those stories allowed them to carry this extra gravitas. I mean, any One Piece fan will tell you, like, a new chapter comes out and it has ramifications that reach out all the way back through the story. So, you know, Frieren is like that in the sense that every single time we learn something new, it changes our entire perspective of everything we've seen. And it might be in only small and subtle ways, but those subtleties build up over the course of the story, and everything it teaches you ends up being important. It never tells you information that's not going to be relevant, that's not going to have some kind of payoff. And so the payoffs are really enormous when they come. And that's really all you can ask for from this type of, super big, long running shonen action series, which this ultimately is. This is from Weekly Shonen Sunday, and man, I really felt strong Inuyasha vibes from the midsection of this manga, but in a good way. Which Inuyasha is a story that I think has a really strong start, great characters, great concept, and it has the same feel of like these fun little punchy adventures. But the problem with Inuyasha is that it just kind of gets bought. It doesn't have like a strong sense of world building and continuity and like interconnectedness between its characters. So as it keeps going, more of it just keeps feeling frivolous. It just feels like, oh, another demon, another bad guy, another group of bad guys, whatever. But with Frieren, there is so much purpose behind what characters it plays with at any given time. And it's not that the manga is like nonstop satisfaction 100% of the time. There are moments where it can be a little bit frustrating, where maybe it'll change gears and introduce a new character that you don't really know if you like, and spend a whole lot of time from that character's perspective, and then switch gears again, and maybe you still don't feel like you understood, like you still don't care about that character yet, but eventually it will always come back around. It always pays off. And there are even a lot of characters that, even right now, they've appeared multiple times over 128 chapters and really don't feel like they've done much of anything. But the story is like winking and nodding and telling you we're coming back. And it's easy to believe that because thematically of how the story is built, what it's about, literally what the story is about, is what makes it capable of being so compelling and trustworthy. So I'm going to have to start diving into that and explaining what the hell is Frieren. But if you're just here for a recommendation, this manga is fantastic. It is definitely deserving to be in the conversation it's in. The fact that it got such an incredible anime adaptation for the first 28 episodes that have come out from Madhouse is very promising for the series' future. It means that the anime can go on in perpetuity as a classic as long as it gets continued. There's reason to believe that it could be not only one of the greatest manga series, but also one of the greatest anime adaptations in the history of these mediums. So, again, it's kind of a remains to be seen. You don't want to get too excited about something that's still happening. The author died tomorrow. All of this goes out the fucking window. It was the most promising manga of all time at that point. But, here's hoping this is the most promising manga and anime series that's going in the 2020s. I think what makes the storytelling of Frieren great is that it is very patient, but without asking patience on the part of the reader. Story actually moves really fast, and it's covering this massive amount of time. It's not dense with dialogue, but it is dense with detail, in that everything that happens matters, because essentially it just never shows you anything that doesn't matter. I mean, you could argue that a lot of it is frivolous, but it's always something fun or memorable, stuff that adds to the personality of the story and characters, and isn't just there for no reason. But that doesn't mean that you really get a full scope of the story early on or anything like that. Like, actually understanding what this story is trying to say, what are the major themes at play, you feel as though you're always learning more as it goes on. It's clear from the beginning that there are certain overarching themes that are going to carry the narrative, that will, make you care about these characters foundationally, but then it just keeps folding in all of this other stuff from, all of these other characters and their perspectives, and just giving you more of the world, and always following from the logical center of the story. It feels like reading any of the best classic fantasy, which so much anime just gets bogged down in really just the fetishistic aspect. Basically, the desire of authors to fuck around, to, get in all their sexual hangups and all their, ponderous ideas that they've had that they wanted to use in a story. And Frieren just feels like it's being created from a position of maturity, almost of responsibility, of a feeling like the author is trying to create something that will be the best audience experience. It's really not about trying to flaunt anything other than, like, the understanding of what would make a good story. Like, it feels as though the author is trying to prove, I can write the best fantasy. And you find yourself kind of nodding along with it, like, yeah, you really found ways to keep it inventive, to surprise me, to use old tropes in new ways. It never feels trite. It never feels like, oh, not this again. Oh, it's this plot line, And that's not to say that it's not full of tropes. There are tons of tropes. They're just all used in ways that are satisfying. It's hard to really describe it without, like, going into the nitty-gritty of every single chapter and every single storyline. And again, I don't think it's always 100% the greatest thing I've ever read, but it is very consistent. If you haven't read or watched Frieren at all, I'm going to get into spoilers. I'm not really going to give, like, a total plot synopsis, because I'm kind of assuming you are familiar somewhat with this if you're bothering to watch this video. But, the first 4 episodes of the anime were released as just like a brick. They were all released at once, and then it was weekly from there on out. And those 4 episodes comprised the first 8 chapters of the manga. It seems like the anime is pretty much one-to-one. They just took 2 chapters of the manga and made an episode of the anime. The pacing of the anime is a little bit slowed down, and I would say it was easier for me to compel myself to read the entire manga than I think it would have been to watch the whole anime first, just because the anime really leans into the slice of life vibe, and I think it brings that to life wonderfully. But that aspect of the manga is something that, like, I appreciate it, but I also appreciate how quickly I can read through it. I appreciate that the characters having, like, a montage that spans 6 months takes 2 pages that I read in 2 seconds in the manga. And in the anime, even though that might only be like 20 or 30 seconds long of a montage, the feeling of that time passing is very different, because with the anime, it really does feel like, and then a lot of time passed. Whereas in the manga, it feels like, and then you blinked your eye and 6 months had happened. Which I think better I'm not saying the anime doesn't communicate this, but I think the manga is even more apt at communicating what Frieren's perspective feels like. Because Frieren is over 1,000 years old. She will live forever. To her, a few years is no big deal. It's just not an amount of time that she recognizes as, significant in the way that humans do. Because humans typically change a lot in a couple of years. And elves typically don't. They will just commit themselves to doing something repetitive for a couple of years at a time, just grinding, because they don't think much of it, because they'll always have time to grow as a person later, if they so choose. Frieren had never really chosen to grow as a person. She had chosen to grow as a mage to the point of being the most powerful mage, pretty much as the second most powerful mage in existence once you really get into the lore of the story. Like, she's more or less the second most powerful human mage, uh, and the other one is another elf who's just been around for even longer and has even more magical skills. But because of the fact that Frieren ended up being the mage who was part of the party that took down the demon lord, and Himmel the hero was this incredibly inspiring guy who really taught her how to enjoy life, she, after his death and realizing that she really didn't take the time to get to know him because she took for granted the fact that he would be around, she's decided to start paying more attention to what's going on in her life. And also, in the effort of paying more attention to what's going on in her life, she starts to remember all of the parallels that being with new people have to when she was with her original group. She starts seeing how these people are similar, how circumstances are similar, or how they're different in interesting ways. And so we kind of are constantly being told two stories at once. We're being told the story of Frieren after Journey's End, with her new party, and also how, because of how it relates to her original story, we're being told the original story as well. And then later into the manga and stuff that I won't spoil for anime onlys, we really start getting into the backstory. But yeah, I'll basically I'll timestamp. I'll break this into two parts where I'm going to talk about stuff that was covered by the anime already, and then I'll talk about stuff that hasn't been covered by the anime yet later, because this is kind of disorganized. So I think I can give a pretty good broad analysis of the manga just talking about stuff that was covered in the anime, and then I'll get into the specifics of the arcs that haven't been covered yet once I'm done with that main part of the discussion. My first exposure to Frieren was the anime starting and immediately getting hyped up on Twitter, and I saw all kinds of gifs from it, and I had the same reaction I did to seeing Made in Abyss for the first time, which was thinking this is definitely going to be the sleeper hit. This is going to be the big show that comes out of this season, and it happened way quicker than I was expecting. This show blew up quickly, and I think a big part of that is just accessibility that is so missing so senselessly from so much anime. There's just been this presupposition that, like, readers just want to see sexuality no matter what. And I I really think that in this modern age where there is so much access to whatever you want, like, there's more and more of a desire to just keep each thing kind of in its lane. Like, if the story doesn't have anything to say about sex or sexuality, or can't handle it in like a mature way, or just it doesn't need to feature it in the story, it's become unpopular to include those aspects as just a matter of course. And Frieren is a story I would consider almost not at all interested in sexuality. It's practically never come up. I don't know if you can even discern the sexuality of any of the characters. There is definitely attraction between Fern and Stark. They are clearly a couple. So that's a thing, but like, it's the most chaste, slow moving. It's more innocent than something Clamp would write. It's that level of non-sexual, and that's the most like. There's a a priest character who is kind of similar to Moroku from Inuyasha in that he's like a pervert and he's looking to get with a hot chick, but he never really succeeds. There's not even really any girls around for him to lust after. It's mostly a joke about that he's into older women, and Frieren is an older woman, but she doesn't have the body that he is expecting from an older woman. But there's even kind of an undercurrent humor there in this idea that like maybe one day when he's older, his taste will have refined to the point that he is attracted to Frieren. I kind of think she's playing the long game. I think she's a cougar on the hound for that priest. I'm just saying I ship it. That's all I'm saying. Is I ship Frieren with I can't even remember his fucking name because he gets written off so quickly. My immediate reaction to Frieren was that she is the most literally me protagonist of a series I've maybe ever seen. It's really hard for me to find anime characters that I strongly relate to. Usually there's just not a lot of characters that have like kind of stoic, standoffish personalities that are portrayed with nuance. Where Frieren, she's clumsy, she's an idiot in certain ways, and it's not just like a lack of social skills. I don't even necessarily. She lacks empathy, and but it's not that she doesn't understand it, or I wouldn't even say she lacks it. Like, it's not that she can't feel it, it's that she hasn't been trying to until a certain point. But the story kind of picks up with her deciding, like, this is what I'm gonna do, is like actively make an attempt to try and connect with people more and understand them more. And that's something I feel like I've also had to make a conscious effort towards, where there's a sort of moment in my life where I woke up and realized, like, I have not been paying attention to fucking any of the people around me at all. It happens a lot when my parents talk about like friends of theirs that have been around my whole life that I've encountered probably dozens of times, and they'll say the name and I can't put a face to that name because I just so wasn't paying attention up until a certain point. I relate to Frieren on a lot of different levels. The level of, having been a different kind of a different person for different periods of life, having different reputations just as a result of having been around for so long, having had different groups that you traveled with and seeing those parallels between those groups. Just there's a lot to. Obviously, I'm nowhere near as old as Frieren is. She's literally 1,000, but because of the fact that for so much of that first like 900 years she was not doing much. I don't want to spoil her one of the things that she was doing at one point, but like there's a lot of periods of her life where she just wasn't really doing anything, and that's also relatable to me because I've had like whole years where I was just like a neat. I was consuming media in a bedroom, I didn't do anything. And it was that same sort of grinding feeling that makes time feel different. I definitely feel like I experience time differently from how other people do. And part of that is also just having a long memory, where Frieren, even though she doesn't pay attention all the time, the stuff she does pay attention to, she never forgets. And I've also got that, where even though I don't remember any of these people's faces, I can remember like exact quotations that people said 15 years ago. I can obviously remember all this stuff that I've seen in anime and manga, all these creators, all their interconnectedness. And I don't think it's like unique to me so much as it is that Frieren does a better job than most stories of just capturing what life is like. And part of that is because anime is so determined to focus on young, spunky, beautiful characters who are at the outset of a story, who are, just starting off. And so with Frieren, there's this opportunity because she's an elf. She has these othering characteristics, the stuff that makes her not exactly like a adult, but at the same time she has the history of an adult, and so she can come into this story feeling like she's at the start of a meaningful adventure and meaningful growth for her as a person, in spite of the fact that she's got this super long history, which is realistic, but I think it can be difficult, especially for young people, to really like conceive of how complicated a person's story really gets as they grow older. And one of the funny things about Frieren is that like it really has a comedic heart. It's always like kind of funny and cheeky even when it's being really serious. And so I do think there's an element of self-parody to it that is also very lovable to me. But part of that is how it starts off with the end of the hero's journey took 10 years. It took 10 years for them to do a normal story. This story basically supposes that it's about to go over the same 10 years again. It's going to just redo the hero's journey. Here's the next stage of the cycle. But because it is telling the story of the previous stage of the cycle at the same time, you have this sense of like collecting the entire history of this world. And in telling that story, it is also referencing way deeper parts of the history, because there are some characters, like the most powerful mage in the world, who have been alive for even longer than Frieren. There are, spells that have been in effect for hundreds of years. There's dwarves that have been working on specific projects for usually 200 years, because they're about 300 years old. It's just always developing the not just the present tense of the story or just the story of 80 years ago, but also just the entire history of the world. And it's so robust and so well shandified. I think these two words, I think the way I use the word robust is my replacement for the ridiculous word shandified that was invented by Mr. Beatongue. But it was in his video about Fallout where he talked about games that allow you to sort of meander and take the story from all kinds of different directions and just kind of settle into the world and answer questions you might have about the setting at your own pace. Frieren is a story where the author does not feel pressured to keep to the main narrative. They're always just kind of breaking away, taking tangents. Himmel himself was described as the tangent king. He's always encouraging that kind of thing. And from an RPG logic perspective, this makes perfect sense, because if you are into these type of games, the optimal way to play them is to break away from the main narrative and do side quests, because those side quests will allow you to gain experience that lets you be stronger when you go back to take on the main events of the story, but also teaches you more about the characters. And usually the draw of these adventures is getting to spend time with these cool and attractive characters. That is the main point of RPGs that are story driven, so this manga is the perfect RPG experience. It's like cut out all everything extraneous about having to actually play a long form JRPG. It's like if a Tales of game was just way better written than any of them have ever been. That's kind of the feel of this manga. As I stand here describing like why this manga is good just on a structural level, it occurs to me there's no way I can get into the details of this without like breaking down chapter by chapter. I wouldn't mind doing that because I do think this is a legitimate classic manga that deserves that level of scrutiny. So I would be interested in doing maybe a weekly show where I covered 2 or 3 chapters at a time and really just broke it down incredibly in depth. If this video can get, we'll say, 10,000 views, if this can get 10,000 views, I think it'll be worth it for me to do that. Otherwise, you'll just have to settle with this for my broad opinion of Frieren for now. But there's just so many characters and plot lines, and like there's plenty of times where the manga is just individual story, little story circle, episodic stuff, and then it'll start building towards something bigger, and then eventually you kind of realize you've gotten locked into like a major arc. And sometimes there's even just little arcs that are kind of building towards the bigger arcs, especially in the recent chapters. So it's there's just so much. It's such a bulky story across these 128 chapters that trying to comment on every single character or every single thing that's cool that I could mention is going to be too much. So I'm going to try to give very broad perspective on this manga. Since it starts with the more episodic stories, I'll just say that I love all of those. Even the ones that aren't really. I mean, I read this entire manga in 2 nights, and it was never a struggle. There was never a moment where I felt like I can't, like I'm not going to be able to finish this tonight because it's just, it's getting boring. Whereas there are plenty of manga that I've gotten 4 or 5 chapters in, and even though I was kind of excited at the start, I already feel like totally burned out on it by a few chapters. So it's like a miracle to me that this has so many small stories, and I was always kind of excited about them. I will say that like sometimes this manga, I can definitely tell when the author is trying to stretch the story out. Sometimes, even though they're only 20 pages, a chapter might really be telling a 10-page story, and so it'll use the first 10 pages to just kind of show the characters like waking up and starting their day. But even when it does that, there's usually at least a unique joke in there, or even just callbacks and references that keep reminding you and reinforcing like the behaviors of the characters. It never feels like it's a waste. It's just like not as dense sometimes. Like sometimes it's taking its sweet time, and I feel the author resting. I feel the gears turning, and it just lets me know that this means they're cooking. Like this is the preparatory process. It's like you'll come off of the high of some fucking massive arc, and then you'll get like, a couple wind down chapters just letting you know what happened with all the characters after that arc. Then you'll get a couple of just one-off little stories that maybe have, a little bit more front end but have a cute little ending. And then, the gears start turning towards another big thing. And you're like, all right, we're fucking getting in the saddle. Let's see what we're in store for. And I have not been disappointed yet. The roughest part of the whole story is like a couple of micro arcs that focus on characters I just haven't clicked with yet. But I don't even think that there's no hope that I'm ever going to click with those characters. I just don't know what the author's trying to do with them. But again, no manga has inspired patience from me on this level. So that's what I feel even just reading the episodic stuff. The first arc that really caught my attention and made me realize I was going to love this story was the first demon arc. The first time that we found out that Frieren is Frieren the Slayer. I should probably scroll back to that volume. And a lot of that is just because I love the demons conceptually as villains. I'm honestly surprised that I haven't seen this type of character done exactly this way before. It seems kind of obvious, and I'm sure there's parallels in other fiction that I just don't know about. But the idea with the demons is that they are just man-eaters that use human language as their tool to ensnare humans. This was kind of parodied, actually, in the first episode of the new Konosuba. And the way that did it made it feel more trite and more like something that I've seen before. But somehow the way Frieren handles these demons, I think just because they have a whole society, like they're not... to the perspective of humans, they are just monsters. They're just beasts. They all need to be eradicated. And Frieren has the exact same perspective as Goblin Slayer on this. And a big part of that is because the demons are constantly insisting that they want coexistence, that they want peace, because that's what gets them closer to humans. And they will go to any lengths to trick humans into letting them in and then eating them and annihilating them. And so the question immediately raised by this is like, is it true? Is it truly impossible for demons and humans to coexist? Our main character believes it is impossible, and she has a kill demons on sight mentality. And the manga does not question this at all in this first arc. It's just like, here's the demons, here's what their tricks are like, and Frieren does not fuck around with this. She's like, these are an existential threat to our kind. They must be eliminated. And I rarely see a manga where the main character has such a hardline stance, unless it's like a really edgy story like Goblin Slayer. Again, this has taken a lot of stuff that anime has been playing with that is really good, that it always loses mainstream audiences on, because like Goblin Slayer has all the excessive rape scenes and, you know, just like all these other stories, when they get into that weird deviant area, they start scaring people away. And I don't even think that Frieren is devoid of deviance. I think it has it, but it's, again, it's like Inuyasha level, maybe even more chaste than Inuyasha, of like accessible to people of any gender or sexuality. It doesn't feel like oppressively straight or oppressively sexual. It's never, you know, making fun of characters for their sex or their sexuality. It's just not really a thing that's commented on that much. I mean, Frieren herself is her gender is almost totally irrelevant to her character, you know. She wears pigtails, she's cute. That's the most feminine aspect of her whole way of being. In that way, I kind of feel like Violet Evergarden walked so that Frieren could run. And you know, that was another story where like you had this really strong character, but not really a strong backing narrative, not really a place to go. And Frieren, what's fascinating about this story, especially to me, is that it pretends like it doesn't. It really acts like it's this meandering Iyashikei, nothing story, while having this unbelievably compelling narrative and like all these political machinations and all this setup going on in the background, and without feeling bloated either, because it never introduces unnecessary characters. Even though there's a couple of parts, particularly the start of the exam arc, where it introduces a lot of new characters, and not all of them necessarily get super developed, they all end up being useful. And like, when the story goes forward, it does not then make up a shitload of new characters all the time. It just keeps reincorporating those old ones and, letting us care about them more and making us feel more justified in the time we already spent with them, because there's these new payoffs that we get to see with them. So yeah, it does a really good job with every character that it has. And again, even the ones it hasn't fleshed out, I have a lot of faith that the author is going to do it, because it's just baked into the structure of the story that's how it operates. I mean, I'm back in volume 2 here, but this is the first time we see Frieren just fucking murder one of the demons. And like, granted, they kind of set you up to understand that Frieren is like this when she kills the guy who created Zoltrak in like episode 3, I think, of the anime. So you know that there is like an undercurrent of violence and that she's, willing to pull the trigger on sentient life. But just her ruthlessness with her approach to demons, because most humans fall for it. Like, most humans, they cannot help themselves but to think that the demons are making sense. But then they always end up betraying it because of these cultural differences. But like, as the story goes on and the more we learn about demons and why they are doing what they do, it does kind of make you feel like maybe they can be understood. It's hard to know if you could ever coexist because the trust issues would run so deep where like we eventually meet demon characters whose entire life is about trying to see how deep they can infiltrate into human society to see if they will end up understanding human emotions. Uh, but just everything about the way demons think and what they prioritize and what they consider moral leads them to killing humans. And so it feels like we are just so incredibly far away from there being understanding between these races that like right now the most understandable thing is just like for each side to try to eradicate one another. And as the story goes on, it becomes more and more clear that like the demons don't understand that humans are an existential threat to demons because of their pride. Like they just don't believe it. They refuse to believe it. But it becomes more clear and like there eventually become like smart enough demons who start to realize like, hey, the real reason we're killing them is not just that we want to eat them. It's that like they will, because we eat them, they will annihilate us. Like ultimately they are never going to trust us. They are going to kill us all. We have to kill them first. And like the humans kind of see it almost as like a mystery. Why do they kill humans even though they're not like they kill us even when their bellies are full? We don't understand why. And it's like, well, you guys would kill them just because they exist, because you suspect that they are going to eat you, and you're probably right. So it's really fascinating that like the manga does a great job of like this isn't a parallel for human racism. It's not a parallel for cultural differences even really because they're different species. And there's a part where I don't remember what half of the manga this is in, whether it's in the part that's been covered by the show or not, but there's a bit where they break down like what is the difference between demons and humans. And it's basically like the metaphor they use is sharks versus whales, where these animals are kind of similar looking and they inhabit a similar environment and they end up having a similar effect on their environment, but they evolved from completely different directions, where a shark is basically the biggest fish and a whale is the most seafaring elephant essentially. Like so they because of the fact that they are just so different, there's no understanding between them and very little chance of understanding between them, even though they ostensibly are very similar. So this is intriguing, especially because it's sort of suggested that the elves and the dwarves are they come from the same lineage as humans. They're not especially different. They have the same kind of understanding. They would not eat one another, whereas demons are just a totally different breed that basically evolved to look like humans to trick them to eat them. So, like, thinking of them as being anything like humans is how you end up getting eaten by them. But does this mean that it is absolutely morally righteous to annihilate them? Like, being myself from the United States, I think about this in comparison to the grizzly bear, and I'm not going to get too deep into an anecdote here, but in the United States, there used to be a lot of grizzly bears, especially out in the Northwest, and it was like really difficult to travel or to live out in those parts of the country because grizzly bears will fuck you up, and they're really hard to kill. But eventually humans got better weapons and, better equipment, and we went out and we basically just fucking killed all the goddamn grizzly bears because we saw them just if they're out there, they're constantly going to be a threat to us. So fuck them. Now, granted, we invaded their territory. We had no business being there. The grizzly bears belonged there. So it's easy to be more sympathetic to the grizzly bears. I don't know the history of, the territories of humans and demons in this story, but there is a nuance in the idea that, like, we are inclined, because we are humans, to be on the side of the humans and to be the characters that we understand and we relate to in the story. But ultimately, the decisions they're making are morally righteous insofar as they are self-protective, and not insofar as demons are inherently, evil from like a overarching religious kind of perspective. Although they could be, because there is also a question of whether religion is real in this story, and that's also really interesting. I have a video where I call Frieren sci-fi, and obviously Frieren is way more indebted to fantasy, especially aesthetics and tropes, than it is to sci-fi, but it does have a very science fiction approach to like its world and the definitions of things. For instance, in this series, curses are just what you call spells that aren't understood yet. If humans don't know how to deal with the spell, if they can't dispel it, they can't cast it, they consider it a curse. Demons just consider these spells. It's just the same as anything else because they understand them. So, you know, there's a lot of stuff that, like, yeah, they're calling it magic, but it has scientific foundation, and to the people who understand it, it's not really magic. It's something they understand. It's something that makes sense. And stuff they don't make sense, they have another name for, but like there is the presupposition that it could make sense, that it should make sense. You just don't have the right perspective to understand it. And demon magic is often seen as illogical by humans because it just doesn't follow the rules that they think reality follows. But demons don't think reality follows those rules. Why? We don't know yet. That's really interesting. Again, there's a ton of questions with regards to demons, ton of potential for what could be done with them. Already a lot has been explored with them, especially in the stuff that comes later. But I'll just say, even just all of that thought I had pretty much just based on the first appearance of the demons. So interesting of a concept, so interesting of a moral question. To me, it's less like asking if like people with different cultures can coexist, and more like asking if humans and cows can coexist, and like be friends. And obviously we do, but like if cows knew that we ate them, would they go to war with us, is a question I think about. Some of them surely know. I can't remember if Stark is introduced before or after that first demon arc, even though I just went back through all of this again. But Stark is a fun character. I like that he has some of the stereotypical aspects of like the warrior or the hero, but feels like his own unique character. I love when they go to new towns and he just befriends everybody and like solves everybody's problems, and is always just completely humble about it. Never tells anyone, never like brags. He's the ultimate good boy, which he has to be because Fern is like, it's so well established by the story. She's the ultimate travel companion for Frieren, like the student who has surpassed the master, the child who is the parent now. She is like, she can't be your waifu because she's too good for you, and so like even Stark, like the boy fights so hard just for the scraps of attention, but he's not desperate either. That's what makes him so lovable. If Stark was even a little bit more desperate for Fern's attention, he would be fucking insufferable. But the fact that he's just like off doing his own thing, being cool, and then like sometimes she's nice to him and he's like, hey, cool, she's nice, and then like most of the time he shows up and everyone's just kind of mad at him for no reason. He's like, all right, well, I guess I'll go back outside. Yeah, he's a lovable character. Fern also, the arc with the priest is all right. I think this guy, clearly there's more to be done with him. I think probably the author realized that they had just introduced him a little too early. Like, um, Freeren's an interesting story because it juggles characters in and out pretty frequently, especially after this point. I definitely think that at the beginning the author was thinking, well, this is about another four people going on a journey, that we have to get the four characters back. We have to set it up so that it's like the original thing that happened. And then this priest character, while he's very cool, he kind of has an overwhelming presence in the story because he is more mature, like Frieren. He can communicate with her more directly, and he's a little like too mellow. He's a little too adult. It kind of overshadows the younger characters, and I think that it was probably a smart idea to write him back out. To just, I think this was rushed. Maybe it was always the intent to just have him there for a little bit to, flesh out little aspects of the characters by having another adult around and then kind of have him fuck off. But, there's been hints that he will come back eventually. But it definitely felt to me like this section, while solid, is all kind of just like, let's flesh it all out a little bit more. And then the story really gets moving when we get into the whole first class mage selections arc. And I was not expecting this manga to be like so much of a shonen manga. This is a fucking tuning exams. Like, if you've read Naruto and the tuning exam arc where like it starts off with the characters in a bunch of groups of threes all out in the woods doing this crazy competition that introduces everybody and shows off their powers, and then they get honed down to a tournament, and then like I mean, even Yu Yu Hakusho's, I guess, the arc where the Genkai pupil selection arc is pretty similar to this as well. It's just like a very well trodden ground shonen arc. It's a perfect type of an arc where if you want to introduce a whole bunch of new characters, you got to establish some kind of like game, some kind of test, some kind of thing that all of them are trying to pass, some kind of, competition where they all have the same goal that allows us to explore why each of them has that goal. And that's what this arc is. It is the most fucking fundamental shonen arc possible, but it shakes up the story massively in a really good way. It really bends the structure of what Frieren is up to this point, because again, we had kind of been building towards the idea that this is going to be just about these four characters on this trip again. And we don't know that much about the original trip other than like the broad strokes of a generic fantasy story. So that's kind of where we'd been going with this new one, following the broad strokes of a generic fantasy story. With the occasional, like, some of those little sub arcs like the demons, I would compare it again to, ever since I mentioned Tales of, I can't stop thinking of that comparison because it feels a lot like those games. But like, you'd show up in a town and there'd be like a story happening in that town that takes a couple hours, ends in a boss fight, and then you move on. That's kind of the feel of that vampire arc. But this breaks that down because this is not something that would usually happen in a JRPG. This is battle manga, pure and simple. And most importantly, it splits up the characters. Fern is with two new characters. Frieren is with two new characters. Stark basically just gets written out of the story for like fucking 25 chapters or something like that. Occasionally it cuts back to just remind you that he exists and he's still hanging out. So, even be damned that priest guy barely had a shot. Even Stark is not considered nearly as essential to this story as Frieren or Fern, which is fair. But tons of new characters get established in this arc. And again, this is what I mean when I say that it's frustrating a little bit because some of these characters are kind of deliberately unlikable. Some of them are introduced as just like bad people or manipulative or kind of, shitty. Some of them are just like that. Some of them are at low moments. Even the ones who are kind of shitty, though, the reasons why they're shitty get more interesting the more you learn about them. So I think a lot of that initial frustration just comes from the fact that it's dumping so much on you and it's so different from what you've gotten up to this point. But again, it starts paying off quickly. And also it's a little frustrating just because I've seen so much of this. Like, Mashal last year had a fucking everybody's fighting in the forest arc. Like, it's just very generic as an idea. So that part kind of makes it feel like, oh wow, I didn't expect Frieren to, you know, have something in it that I have seen in every other battle shonen. But again, the story was always built from tropes. Everything in it is something I've seen a million times. Just the other stuff is from JRPGs and isekai, not from battle shonen. I'm glad that it did this. I'm glad that it broke it up and did this arc because it does the arc really well. It feels like I'm reading Yu Yu Hakusho or Hunter x Hunter. It's like on that level of, clever tactics, good character writing, interesting side plots, complicated strategies that come together well. I have a strong suspicion that this manga is making lots of references to Sun Tzu's Art of War. I have not read slash listened to all of that. I've listened to half the audiobook of it. And I do think it's one of those things where a lot of the stuff that it says has kind of entered into common sense over time. Or is just like conclusions you can come to by thinking about people. But it really is like one of the early texts of psychology. And this manga it's about how decision making is informed by people's personality and past and like who they are and how those decisions have ramifications that go forward. And so, it's always diving into the pasts of these characters to try to give us a sense of why they're doing this stuff and what it's going to mean for everybody else, why they disagree, where their disagreements come to a head. It feels very realistic and historical in that way. And so it's just always able to, present these characters who feel like they really live in the world, who feel like they have purpose in the story. And, even if they aren't going to be around forever, like they'll make a contribution that matters and then they bow out. It doesn't feel like everybody has to be around forever and it's just like an excuse for all these cool characters to hang out. It's like they're there to do what they have to do in the story and they're not there when they don't have something to do, which is refreshing. I think the anime probably covers I still have only seen the first 4 episodes. I'll probably watch the rest of it now that I'm caught up on the manga. But I wanted to know the whole story. I think the anime covers up through the end of the first class mage selections arc because that takes like exactly 58 chapters and there's or something like that, or 60 something. There's 28 episodes of the anime, and so I think there's like an equivalent number of chapters in that arc. But yeah, there's lots of times where characters are like saying tactical ideas and aphorisms as though they are quoting a book that everyone has read, and there's also like direct references to the Art of War. There's like this homeless guy who keeps complimenting Stark on having nearly mastered the Art of War. So yeah, I definitely think it's drawing on Sun Tzu's ideas about psychology and tactics in order to build its world and characters, and specifically why they make the decisions they make in battle, because all of them are kind of like remembering principles from the Art of War while they're in the middle of fighting. It also does like an incredible job of justifying all of its powers, why they can do what they do, their interactions. Like, I've always seen JoJo get a lot of praise for the fact that its battles do such a good job of like explaining the powers and then creating exciting scenarios out of those powers. But to me, it's always felt like JoJo can kind of just do whatever it wants because every single battle is its own little closed story that has little to do with the other battles usually. And in this story, there's always a sensation of building, of like the characters are learning together. All of these characters are basically the most powerful mages in the world that are not already in like seats of government, that are not already recognized as the most powerful mages in the world. So like all of them together, like they are kind of OP, but none more so than Frieren. But even she, is like, yeah, she's comparable to the other first class mages, but doesn't mean she's better. And so there's kind of like a game of chess going on between, can she decode what other mages of her caliber are thinking in order to get through their tactics, there's kind of this implication after they complete the trial that it wouldn't, nowhere near as many people would have passed if Frieren hadn't been there. And so there's like a secondary screening process, but even still, like more than half of them pass because there's just so many badasses in this generation. And like, because this arc is quite so long, it does feel earned. Like when you see all those characters get their first class mage status, you're like, yeah, I know those characters are badass because I just watched them prove it, for an extensive period of time. And then going into the future, when they go, get assigned to these like big, meaningful tasks with huge consequences in the world, it feels like, all right, whatever this threat is, it's at a level that these characters we already know are badass have to deal with it. So it just, the stakes feel that much higher going forward. And so that pretty much covers what I think the anime covers. So if you don't want to hear about anything the anime hasn't talked about yet, stop watching here. Immediately after the whole first class mage selection arc, there's a pretty hard slowdown where, it really kind of grinds down back to the episodic stories. We got a little bit of reincorporation of some of the characters from that previous arc, but it definitely slows the hell down and goes back to being Frieren. It's the same vibe as like, whenever Rick and Morty is like, we're just gonna go back to good old Rick and Morty adventures, Morty, no more of this plot bullshit, it's just 100 years Frieren. It's fine, it's just kind of reminding you what this manga really is when it's not doing like a fucking 30 chapter long arc. But it's also like really nice to know that this manga can have 30 chapter long arcs. I don't think anything yet has been as long. I don't know how long the Golden Kingdom arc is. It's the second longest probably, but I don't think it's as long as the First Class Mages arc. I could be wrong. I would say that easily the least interesting arc to me so far has been the one where they have to fight this big four-armed demon, and they're fighting alongside the one of the proctors from the exam. I'm trying to catch up to that. I actually forgot just how many little side stories and mini arcs there were in between these arcs. Here we go. Yeah, this guy, the priest guy. This character just didn't leave enough of an impact on me for this arc to really work. I really struggle in anime with these kind of fringe characters who like really are stuck on the idea that like they're a really bad guy and like a sociopath, but they're actually a really good guy. And like that's fine. I don't mind that as like a characterization or like a trait. It's just having to listen to all of the stuff that they say, like all of their reasoning for like how they see themselves, that the story feels like it's telling you this stuff's not true. Like this guy believes himself to be an asshole, but he's not. But like he'll go on and on and on about like why he's an asshole, and I'm just like, bro. The story is also telling me you're fucking wrong. So I don't know why I have to hear, you know, I don't know. I think the author is fascinated with these kinds of like sociopathic, you know, people with who have a difficulty with empathy. Like obviously Frieren herself, um, at the start of the story is considered like this very cold person by her travel companions, but it doesn't really take long for the story to really soften her up. Like she obviously loves Fern and Stark. By the time you get to that second adventure arc we just went through, it's so much of fun times, and she's such a caring, like motherly, or really more of like a obnoxious big sister. Um, like it's hard to see her as like this cold, calculating person that she was at the start. So I understand why they would introduce characters that could explore those themes again by being like maybe even more edgy, even more difficult. But again, it just, I don't know. This arc didn't hit me. I didn't get anything emotionally out of it. The villain didn't seem particularly interesting. It kind of felt like a retread of the first demon arc. Like it was reestablishing what makes these demons so difficult, why they have to be combated. And I guess it was good to, reintroduce the demons and everything before we get into the whole Golden City arc, which is like bringing them back into the focus completely. But that is definitely the arc that has opened this story up. The Gold Kingdom arc is the one where it feels like everything kind of clicks into place, and it kind of reveals its hand of like, this is what Frieren really is, like at the height of its power. I do think it's probably the best arc yet. I don't know if it's difficult because from a writing perspective, for me as like a technical writer, I'm very impressed with what was accomplished by the whole training arc, like structurally introducing all these characters, establishing them all, keeping it exciting across all those chapters. It's just that it was like so trite of a concept, whereas this arc feels so much more unique. It plays around a lot more with the nature of Frieren as a story that takes place across an extremely long time. It's, about characters with a long history who've encountered Frieren in the past. Does a ton of legwork and world building in the story, has an incredibly satisfying climax. So I do think the Gold Kingdom arc is like, it's only possible because of all the legwork that the story had already done up to that point, but it pays off all that legwork so fucking well. It's hard not to think that it's the best arc of the story so far. Now, my brother Shade told me that this arc was overhyped for him because his friend told him that it was better than Water 7 from One Piece, which is apparently the most beloved arc of One Piece. I still have not read that much of One Piece, so I can't comment on what I think is the best One Piece arc. But do I think that this arc competes with the very best arcs in all of manga? I think it is in the conversation, but would I pick it? No. I don't think that this arc is as mind-blowing as the heights reached by Yu Yu Hakusho or Hunter x Hunter. I'm struggling to think of a third example. It definitely, for me, felt like the moment when this story kind of replaced a lot of stuff in my mind. Like I mentioned earlier that it kind of pays off having to sit through so much isekai and stuff, and like even stuff I like the slime story. I kind of almost begrudgingly enjoyed that story. Like I like the themes, I like the characters, I like the way the anime is presented, but I don't think it has like a strong core structure or driving narrative. It kind of feels like a slice of life story where sometimes things happen and those things are cool, but like the level of build up again in Frieren where like you really got like a lot of cooking time, man. A lot of time in the oven. A lot of time to set up all this shit. And this is another arc where, like, it started off a little bit frustrating to me because it does introduce these new characters that initially you're not sure if you care about. And, like, I was very glad that they grounded it all in the old dude from the I don't remember his name, from the first first class mage training thing, because he was the standout. Oh, hey, here's the bit where they're explaining the whole, shark versus porpoise thing. Um, I think the old guy was the standout character from that whole arc, and to establish this new villain who ends up being connected to him, and that he literally trained him when he was a kid, and he becomes kind of. I sort of suspected that a character like this was inevitable during the first demon arc, where like I thought there's going to be a demon who's going to go all the way and trying to see how far he can get into human society. And that's exactly what this guy's purpose is, but it's very explicit from the beginning. He wants to get in with humans so that he can have a best friend, kill them, and see if he feels like regret. I think that's the emotion he's specifically trying to understand a couple of human emotions that demons just don't have. And the human who he ends up developing this relationship with is a noble in charge of this city that's almost entirely run by nobles who are all super corrupt, and there's nothing he thinks he can do about it. So he kind of just starts working with this demon to start eliminating some of the most corrupt people and just fucking, start trying to make the city a better place. And he kind of ingratiates this demon to the humans in the city, and everybody trusts him except for the actual guy he's friends with. Like, this guy always knows, like, this demon wants to kill me. Like, he's just hanging out with me because he's going to try to kill me eventually. I'm just going to use him for all he's worth, and eventually he's going to take my ass to hell with him. And so, like, it's a really interesting dynamic because like, both characters understand the foregone conclusion of one day you are going to show your true colors and you're going to fuck all this up. It's not mysterious that's going to happen. But then the question becomes, like, will he change his mind? Will anything be different by the time it happens? What will the ramifications be if he doesn't? And because I'm going full spoilers on this, I'll tell you he doesn't change his mind. He kills his friend. He ends up feeling nothing. He's just like, I'm going to continue being a ruthless demon. But there's this other girl, and she is even more understanding than him, and she's been around even longer. She's considered a nameless demon. I love this badass detail where Frieren's like, if you've never heard of a greater demon, that means they've killed everyone who's ever encountered them, so you really need to stay away. And this girl, she simultaneously exhibits more understanding of human psychology than any other, but also the way she treats humans is so obviously wrong that you would never confuse her for a human, which is really interesting. It's like it's the subtleties of what is different between demons and humans in this manga is really fucking brilliant. And again, this is stuff I'd have to fucking break down on a particular, like, line by line basis to explain why it's so good. But yeah, it's incredible to read when this character shows up because she's the most threatening demon yet. It's really hard to describe her personality because she's got a lot of that mysteriousness, that cheeky, you don't entirely understand what she's trying for, but basically she's come to the conclusion that humans and demons cannot coexist, but anybody who is trying is like particularly a threat because they're trying to make it easier to annihilate. Like, basically, she's the only person who understands the fact that humans are an existential threat to demons. That's why she always annihilates them. That's why she doesn't want her name ever getting out there, because she's like, no, they will kill you if they know about you. Given enough time, you will eventually, they'll find an opening and they will kill your ass, unless you leave no openings. So basically, she's the only person who respects the tenacity of prey to continue going on, and how as demons they have no understanding of that because they do not consider themselves as prey, in spite of the fact that Frieren has killed fucking thousands of them over hundreds of years. So yeah, all of that is pretty much what makes this arc so good, and the fact that just like everything that's been set up by the story comes to a head. You've got the most badass characters having the most badass fight. The powers have gotten like ridiculously over the top, shonen battle stuff, but it all feels so justified within the narrative because it's all explained. You feel like you've learned how this stuff works alongside the characters. It's awesome. It's super exciting. It's crazy to see, like, this level of shonen battle successfully pulled off without breaking the setting of what by all appearances is a traditional fantasy story with all the lore, all of the like bells and whistles you'd expect, all of the like attention to detail and trying to make sense, not like breaking its internal logic. It all flows correctly and just comes to these big emotional conclusions. The ending of this arc again, super satisfying. Um, you know, some of the some stuff I don't know, it doesn't even really feel ass pulley. Like I'm thinking back on it and I'm like everything is so fucking well established that you never really feel like yeah, sure characters are getting lucky here and there. Like there's it's a story, it's fun action, but it always feels justified in whatever turns it takes. And that whole arc is super satisfying. Again, do I think it's one of the greatest arcs in all of manga? I just don't think it's got enough emotional impact for me. I could see maybe if you connected with the main characters of this arc a little bit more than I did. Um, it does sort of still fall into the category for me of like being a little too much of like an exploration of characters who are interesting because of what they stand for thematically and not because they're like actually interesting, endearing characters. I cannot remember the name of the demon that turns things to gold. Like, I remember what he looked like, very cool design. I remember what he stands for, but like he's not. It's interesting because I'm thinking about comparing him to like Meruem, right, from Chimera Ant, and like that was a character that I probably couldn't explain to you much of like what was his philosophy, what was he going for, because I don't remember, but I do remember the emotional story beats of his development, and I also feel that way about this character. I would say the only thing that makes him feel weaker is just having less time with him. That like that arc was not as ridiculously complicated and um inventive as Chimera Ant. But does that mean it's worse? I mean, Chimera Ant has like a lot of bullshit that it makes it difficult to revisit. It's not like a like it's more interesting on a conceptual level than it is as an actual experience. And I think Frieren really just does both. Find you a manga that can do both. This is that manga. The manga where the arcs are like as emotionally engaging and meaningful on a character level as they are interesting conceptually. So, I thought this popularity poll, by the way, is fucking hilarious. The Mimic is the third most popular character in in Frieren. I can't believe Himmel is more popular than Frieren. Also, I don't know how the fuck that could possibly be, but I guess everybody just wants to be that guy. Um, but yeah, so that's the Golden Kingdom arc. Regardless of whether you think it's literally the greatest fucking shonen arc ever, it is very, very good. And then we launched into this totally unexpected, but in my opinion, very welcome arc that just wrapped up with time travel. And maybe my favorite fucking time travel conceit I've seen in a long time, particularly the way that this starts, though, with the color pages and everything, was brilliant. Basically, this whole story has always hinged on the idea that Frieren is redoing the adventure from 80 years ago. And so we've cut back to that. We've always been learning more about it. We've had it more fleshed out. But this arc, it's the setup is so genius. They're going towards this tablet, and Frieren's like, I just remember that I touched the tablet, and then I woke up like a week later with no memory of what had happened in the last week. And they were like, well, that sounds fucking awful. Why do you want to do that again? And she's like, I just got to know what was the deal with that. So she touches the tablet, and then she time travels back to the past. Was it her physical body? Is it just her mind that transported? It's not clear, but it just makes so much sense, and it clicks into place. Like as soon as she gets sent back, you're like, oh, she lost her memories for a week because her future self was the one who experienced that time, and her past self doesn't remember it, which is why it hasn't had an effect on the future. And of course, her first concern becomes like, I can't change anything about the past, because I might change the future. Now, this is a closed time loop, which I figured it would be, just because from dramatic storytelling perspective, it makes the most sense. If she's going to go back to the present, nothing is going to have changed, because butterfly effect, it would have changed too much. But there is the implication that while this was happening, the demons were aware, because demons have some kind of space-time fuckery going on with their magic, and the story is only just starting to get into exploring it, and I will be so fucking impressed if they can make all of this shit continue to make sense. But yeah, basically the demons figure out that there is a time anomaly that they can take advantage of, where Frieren is herself from the future, and if they could kill her or learn her magic while she's here, they can alter the course of history. So they try to do that, and it turns it into it turns what starts off as just kind of a fun time travel, Freeren's back in the party, but she can't really communicate because she's trying not to fuck up the past, into a battle to preserve the sanctity of the timeline, and all of it ends up happening in a way where it makes sense, it makes sense why simultaneously the situation could only have prevailed if Frieren from the future was inhabiting her past self's mind, but also it all transpires in a way that it doesn't fuck with, it makes sense that this had happened and that she just doesn't remember it. That nobody told her because they're trying not to fuck up. She tells them don't tell anyone, don't tell me, just don't let anybody know that this happened. So the heroes really did go to their grave always knowing that they met a Frieren from the future. They know that that the world's a better place, that they do not learn whether they beat the demon lord, but it kind of seems obvious, it's just really interesting to think that the heroes actually continued the rest of their journey kind of aware of what the future was going to be a little bit, just through the implication of a future Frieren having arrived, and they never said anything about it. She was the only one who didn't know. It's brilliant. It's once again recontextualizes the entire story while also fleshing it out, giving tons of detail. It gives us more time with these characters. I really do think the author probably just wanted to spend more time with them. After drawing all these new characters for a long time, just wanting to go back, explore the original party, flesh out their dynamic, make us really care about them as characters and not just as the memory of who they were, and how that informs the story now. It feels like we now have told their story. We did get to go on their adventure and not just hear about it. So yeah, I thought this was a really strong time travel arc. It starts off it goes for a while before the demons get involved and it really becomes a serious story thing. And that was kind of the cherry on top, it was already pretty good, and then it got wild good when it, and you have this built-in time limit where it's only going to be a week, because she said at the start that's how much I remember. You're pretty sure it's not going to fuck with the timeline, so it's okay, she's going to be here for a week. But because of the fact that I'll call it authorial time dilation is such a big part of this story, where sometimes 6 months pass inside of a page and sometimes a week takes 20 chapters, and so this is a pretty fleshed out arc of, we learned everything that happened that week, as compared to most of the adventure we have no fucking idea. And I think it was just a good way to do it. It made me think the author probably planned this way ahead of time. Honestly, a lot of this manga, I do think the big arcs probably the author has like the general structure of the story and like what big points it has to hit already in mind, and then kind of just has to, generate all the designs and like figure out who the characters are as the story goes. But you really feel that like work in progress from this manga. Like it always, when it slows down, you can feel it building towards something bigger, and then again it pays off in these big ways. And just there are so many hints in the way the manga is structured of how long it will be, how much more there is to come, and it feels like a ton. It feels like there's so much more. So yeah, if I end up doing a like in-depth exploration of this manga, um, I'll probably bring on guests like my brother Shade to talk about it with me, really get into the nitty gritty of every single fucking page and exchange and piece of dialogue, because it really do be deep like that. And as long as we could catch up to it, we could make it a regular part of Manga Mondays as a weekly coverage. I mean, I'll cover new chapters anyways in Manga Monday, but I'd love to have covered the entire series bit by bit. So, yeah, tell me what you think of that idea in the comments, and thanks for watching. Frieren forever.